The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Our topic today, negotiations in Israel. Stalled Israeli-Palestinian talks are in the news again as Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas sent a letter to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu outlining his requirements for the resumption of negotiations. With the formal Israeli response expected shortly, we'll look today at prospects of a new round of talks and at the recent history of negotiations in Israel. Joining us is Moty Cristal, founder and CEO of Nest Consulting. He established the firm following a career as one of the Israeli government's leading negotiators. He held official positions in the Israeli negotiation teams with Jordan and the Palestinians within the Ministry of Defense and the Prime Minister's office. He now serves as a negotiation consultant to the private and public sector leaders. Moty Cristal, welcome to Milwaukee and International Focus.
Thank you very much, Doug.
Well, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit at the outset about the process of negotiation. And, you know, when we think of negotiations in Israel, we think in terms of the protracted history of the peace talks. Now, your background is often found you in situations where you're negotiating in a much more compressed time frame, in sort of a crisis management mode. So, from the negotiator's perspective, how do those two situations differ?
They are completely different. Crisis negotiation aims to resolve a specific, usually high-stakes crisis. It could be in the public sector, in the military arena, in the private sector. And the political process is a long process. I think that in the Middle East, many are in love with the word process because it guarantees, I would say, a never-ending dynamics that changes, depends of the external activities, external realities, types of leadership. There were in the past several opportunities that the Israelis and Palestinians were very close to achieve some sort of an agreement. And I will elaborate what do I mean, some sort of an agreement. In the world of negotiations, I think that the word peace is a popular word. The word peace is something that describes, I would say, a wishful thinking, a vision, a desire. Peace is not a political reality. In professional language, we use the term conflict management agreement or conflict resolution agreement. And the question is what the parties are seeking. I believe that after two failed attempts, one in 2000 with Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Chairman Arafat, and the second with Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and Chairman Abbas, two opportunities for the sides to really resolve the conflict, which means that all the issues open for discussions were at the table, discussed, not necessarily agreed, but twice the parties failed to reach a comprehensive conflict resolution agreement. Maybe it's about time to change a bit the paradigm and think about different outcome, an outcome which we might call it peace for marketing purposes, but the essence will be a long-term ceasefire, a conflict management agreement, which means the parties say, actually, we cannot resolve all the issues. The conflict is, to some extent, intractable. The dynamics, the religions, the Arab Spring, all these cannot bring us to really touch upon the most fundamental issues of identity of a Jewish state among Arab countries or states, the right of return the Palestinians demand. Maybe we should focus on something much more humble, something much more feasible, which is a conflict management agreement. For example, let's agree that a Palestinian state will be established along agreed upon borders, certain security arrangements, center economic agreements. Let Palestine flourish, thrive, after 10, 15, 20 years of establishing good neighboring relations, I hope, we can turn into the contested issues of Jerusalem and refugees and end of conflict or finality of claims. I think it's about time that we stop, if we really want to reach an agreement, we stop thinking in terms of big conflict resolution agreement and rather think of a conflict management settlement.
Well, I must say that surprises me a bit in that it sounds a bit like the hudna that Hamas is proposing, where we're not going to resolve these differences, but at least we'll agree to a truce.
Let's talk hudna. Let's talk hudna. If this type of an agreement is translated, marketed, or translated into the Arab or Muslim context as a hudna, let's call it hudna. Let's call it a table. Let's call it conflict management. Whatever the name is, I need to know that the outcome is something which not necessarily addresses the root causes of the conflict, and not necessarily brings an end to the conflict. And many will argue why. Well, Israel will have to pay in a hard currency. And I said, actually, I want to pay in hard currency. I want to divide the land between Israel and Palestine, because, as Prime Minister Olmert said very deliberately in the Annapolis 2008 Annapolis process, the establishment of a Palestinian state is an interest of Israel as a Jewish state. Because when you take into consideration demography, if Israel will not work actively to establish a Palestinian state along agreed borders, Israel in 10 years, 5 years, depends on which demographic expert you read, Israel will turn into either neither a democratic state or non-Jewish state because of demography. And it is an interest in order to maintain and preserve the Jewish or the Zionist enterprise, the Jewish state. It is an interest of Israelis, Israeli government, to put a clear border between a Palestinian state and state of Israel.
But then we have the interplay of politics with that process. I mean, I think the two alternatives you have suggested of either a sort of Jewish minority within the whole of the territory, or some situation where there is a non-Jewish majority who don't have the same political rights, both of which are politically problematic. So could it be that the current and long history of negotiations, if you'd like to call them that, were largely, in part, a way of avoiding that tough decision?
Yes, it was avoiding tough decisions. Even the Oslo Agreement, or the interim agreement, did not stipulate what should the end goal be. Even the very famous 1995 interim agreement that Prime Minister Rabin was killed for signing it has not stipulated what should be the end game. Why? Because of conflict avoidance, because of because of political dynamics. Now, situation, I think, does not allow the overall strategic situation doesn't allow Israel to continue to delay, to postpone decisions.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, you can broadly divide the strategic environment in which Israel finds itself into several discrete eras. So the first being sort of from the foundation of the state onwards, where the primary threat was conventional conflict with its neighbors, right? With Camp David, with the peace treaty with Jordan, that largely was a settled issue. Then there was an era where the primary strategic concerns seemed to be domestic and with relationship to the Palestinians, the era of the intifadas. And so if we assume that era has closed, what is the new strategic environment?
The new strategic environment is chaotic. The new strategic environment is extremely volatile because of mainly the Arab Spring and the revolutionary area that's surrounding the Israel's borders, and the threat emanating from nuclear Iran. At the moment, we are quite lucky in terms of Israel that the Palestinians have not revolted, and the Arab Spring to some extent skipped the Palestinian territories. But what we see today is a chaotic reality with very little stability hooks. Unfortunately, those stable hooks are not really in favor of Israel, like Iran or Turkey. But we see unstable reality in Egypt. We see instability in Syria. Lebanon was always an unstable reality with dual governance there. Jordan, at the moment, is stable, but we have to remember that it has like a significant majority of Palestinians. So the situation, I think, from my perspective, requires a very decisive leadership call on behalf of Israeli leadership, Palestinian leadership. Try to reach some sort of a stable reality agreed upon. It doesn't have to be the permanent status agreement. It can be something which will makes us, plant a grain of stability in Israel-Palestine relationship. I think in that sense, the establishment of a Palestinian state is something that Israel should pursue. And the big challenge is the current situation between Israeli and Palestinians. The leading international negotiation scholar, Professor Bill Zartman from Johns Hopkins University, coined it, especially for our case, S5. It's a soft, stable, self-sustained stalemate, which means that no party has really internal incentive, because of politics, to change the current status quo. I understand from for our right-wing government in Israel, the decision to establish a Palestinian state is unthinkable. I understand that for the Palestinian internal fight between Hamas and Fatah, or internal Hamas, it's unthinkable to establish a Palestinian state without granting all the rights they claim. This is why it's so soft and stable, and there is no internal motivation. What we'll need is, again, a leadership call from both sides to take this to an agreed-upon outcome, or, for God bid, another round of violence. Another round of violence which will force the parties to come to the table and to come to this agreement. As a negotiator, many times I say to my clients, that's the zone of possible agreement. That is the range of agreement that we can reach. We have two ways. We have the short way, which means negotiate with the person you hate, your former partner, something like this, or go to court. It will take you a year. You have to pay a lot of money for lawyers, a year or two, and then you will settle on the same agreement. So you have the short, relatively cheap way, or the long, relatively more expensive way.
Well, we'll talk about those two paths going forward, but first we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with Moty Cristal about negotiations in Israel. Well, one of the things that seems to be recommended in some quarters to force the situation is for the Palestinians to basically turn the keys over to the Palestinian Authority and say, okay, this won't work. There's a letter from Yossi Beilin to Mahmoud Abbas recently where he advised him to do just that. Do you think that that's likely? And as a negotiator, is that a good strategy?
You know, I will not comment on Yossi Beilin's letter to Arafat. I will comment on the structure of negotiations. Many times when you go to negotiate, you would like to have a valid alternative, which means if I'm not come to an agreement with you in what I think is a fair deal, I will go and turn to the other side or to other client or to other supplier. I have a better alternative. The Palestinians tried to produce a better alternative through going to the UN and trying to. I'm still wondering whether it was the very successful Israel campaign or it was their fear that finally they will get a state. Palestinians had so many opportunities in the last decades to make a Ben Gurion act and to say, okay, give me what you can and I'll see what I do with it. For years, until Salam Fayyad came to power, the Palestinians were not working, they were not investing in building their government institution capabilities. To some extent, it seems throughout the years that they liked to be the underdog or the powerless party, the poor stateless nation, despite the fact that at least three times, if you count the UN, with Barak, with Olmert, and with the UN, they could have crystallized the idea of a Palestinian state. From a negotiation perspective, that you had so many opportunities, why you didn't do it? That's a key question. My explanation is just that they are afraid of taking the responsibilities of running a state. From that perspective, even Hamas, who they control a territory, they provide all the services, they maintain or they exercise a foreign policy and economic policy. They rule the people. So I say the same to Abu Mazen. You want a Palestinian state? You can have it tomorrow. Go to the UN, not to the Security Council. Go to the UN, General Assembly, establish a Palestinian state, and then deal with it. Negotiate with Israel from a position to state to state. It will have a lot of consequences. Mostly negative for both sides, but at least it will break this S5 deadlock. They don't do it. I wonder why.
Well, and you mentioned Mr. Fayyad. Now, what do we make of stories in the press where we see there's a bit of a split between him and Abu Mazen these days? Does that have any impact on the situation going forward?
It has an impact because if you want to negotiate, you need a partner on the other side. And you need a partner that is legitimate representatives, a partner who takes responsibility. You want a partner who is capable to deliver and could be held accountable. At the moment, we don't see such a partner on the Palestinian side because of the divide. Gaza, West Bank, because of the divide Fatah, Hamas. You can argue that the Israeli political system or the Israeli political scene is also divided. By the end of the day, there is a democratically legitimate government, and the Prime Minister, if the Prime Minister will take a decision to negotiate or to establish a Palestinian state, it is a democracy. On the Palestinian side, one of the weaknesses or one of the disadvantages of the current situation from an Israeli perspective is that you don't see a reliable partner with whom we can negotiate and will be able to deliver. So for me, it's Hamas, Hania. I'm a negotiator. I will negotiate with whoever show me that is capable to deliver. And remember, peace you do with enemies. So if Hamas will say, okay, move aside Abu Mazen, move aside Fayyad, I want to negotiate with you, it will be a much tougher negotiation. But we already concluded agreement or two with Hamas.
So President Peres was in Haaretz recently saying exactly that that Abu Mazen, it was someone with whom we could reach a deal, someone who could deliver the goods. Would you share that assessment or not?
Not from the facts that I know and not from the reality so far. If Abu Mazen would have been a leader that could deliver an agreement, I think that he would have pursued whatever alternative is, whether the UN or a reconciliation agreement with the Hamas or negotiation with Netanyahu. Okay? Netanyahu is doing Abu Mazen the old trick of no preconditions. Come to talk. And the Palestinians fall again and again to this trap of the precondition of stop settlement or not stop settlement. Why? You know that the right-wing Israeli government will not stop settlement activities. You know that in an election year, Obama will not impose any pressure on Netanyahu. He's already burned relationship. They know all this. They have a very good reality check. So I have no good explanation rather than what I call this statehood fear or statehood anxiety. They prefer to stay in this status quo, which unfortunately is also good for the right-wing settlers. But in the overall, it is bad for the Palestinian people and for the 80% majority of Israeli Zionist Jews.
Well, do you think it would be politically acceptable on the Palestinian side to have some sort of agreement that didn't address those sort of final status issues?
What is the alternative? Do they have a better alternative? If they have a better alternative, go pursue it. If you don't have a better alternative, let's, compromise.
Well, you were very involved in the 2000 Camp David process, and essentially it seems like what was on the table was something that very closely resembled what you're talking about. And Arafat at that time was unable to seal the deal. He just couldn't say yes. Do you think the internal Palestinian dynamic has changed to make that possible this time around?
Unfortunately, no. Unfortunately, I think that the divide, from what I see, again, I might be biased, I am biased, I'm an Israeli, but from what I observe, the dynamics on the Palestinian side, I see that situation and the capability to take decisions only deteriorated throughout the years. Arafat had the potential to be the historic Palestinian leader who will make the historic compromise. He had the potential to be the Ben Gurion. I know that I'm saying something that did not say like comparing Arafat to Ben Gurion, but from a negotiation perspective, it's a valid comparison. Arafat had this capability. He has chosen not to do that. Now, whether Abu Mazen can do it, I doubt. Whether Barghouti can do it, maybe. Whether a Hamas leader can do it, I doubt. I don't know. That's the main challenge which, unfortunately, right-wing settlers take advantage at the moment, that there is no Palestinian partner that with whom we can negotiate whatever agreement that will come and said, Netanyahu, let's not stop settlement. Let's start to negotiate. One condition, before we start negotiate, let's agree on the rules of the game. Rules of the game will be, 6 months bona fide negotiations. We negotiate bilaterally. We don't need the Americans. We report to the quartets every 3 months. No blame game. If not, we don't reach an agreement within 6 months, then whatever. I go to the UN. I wish the Palestinians would have taken this type of leadership control, process leadership.
Well, is there a generational aspect of this? I mean, is it? Are there? You mentioned Marwan Barghouti, for example. I mean, is that a aspect of this? I mean, if we got to the next generation of leadership,
well, that's an interesting question. Moses got the mission to take the people of Israel out of Egypt, and he was not the leader that was tasked to conquer the land and to take the people inside the land because his, failed negotiations with God. Maybe it's a matter of generational leadership on the Palestinian side. There was the leadership, the revolutionary leadership, but in order to compromise, you need a different leader. From my experience, talking with my Palestinian colleagues, they are extremely smart, brilliant, capable, willingness to compromise, willingness to come to an agreement, unwilling to compromise their historic rights. They articulate very accurately and passionately their narrative, but there are people that are very competent rivals across the negotiation table. Whether they can take the historic decision, it's up to them.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. Moty Cristal, thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you very much.
For our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.